In this video, I want to share with you some key moments from a series of discussion by two archaeologists. One, Dr. Matthew Adams, and the other one is Professor Israel Finkelstein, who is also one of the authors of one of the books that we've been commentating on called The Bible Unearthed. And so in this video, these scholars, they're going to be going over some of the background that caused the formation of early Israel. And it's also going to talk about who exactly were the Israelites before they became the Israelites. And so this is similar to one of the videos that we made called Who Were the Ancient Israelites Revealed? But it's different because this is coming directly from the mouths of scholars who helped crack the code. And so here we go.
Israel Finkelstein is a leading figure in the archaeology and history of ancient Israel. Over 40 years of field work and research, he has helped to change the way archaeology is conducted, the Bible is interpreted, and the history of Israel is reconstructed. I sat down with Israel over several sessions to talk about how a lifetime of work has informed the story of ancient Israel.
Today we're going to begin our series of video clips about the archaeology of ancient Israel and the Bible. And today I'd like to talk about the very beginning to introduce the whole topic. And that kind of begs the question, what is the beginning of a discussion about ancient Israel? Where do we need to start?
This is a great question because there are two options here. Either to go with the Bible. The Bible has a very clear notion about the history of ancient Israel. It starts with patriarchs, it goes to the Exodus, then wandering, conquest, period of the judges, and then the beginning of the monarchy and the two Hebrew kingdoms, and destruction, of course. This is one way to go about this.
So the first way is to accept the biblical narrative as it is written and take "Thus saith the Lord" as the truth on ancient Israel.
The second way to go is to take the perspective of historical reconstruction of the ancient Near East, Canaan, Israel, and what archaeology tells us. And we will go according to the second.
He said, we will go according to the second one. That's because they already learned the lesson on what happens when you try to rely strictly on the Bible. It's going to lead you to a destination called all the wrong places. And therefore, since they know that, they'll rely primarily on the second option, which is using archaeology.
Great. So we want to start with what we know from outside sources and bring in the biblical text as needed.
Critically, the idea is to describe the history of ancient Israel using three tools.
Using three tools. And tools are what we talk about frequently on this channel because everything is a tool and it's used to do something with it, right? And in this case, they're looking for the origins of ancient Israelites and they're using three tools, which are...
The first one, of course, is the biblical text, critically looking at it. The second one is archaeology, also critically looking, and of course, the records of the ancient Near East.
So what's the period that we need to start with?
So I think that we need to start with the Late Bronze Age, because the Late Bronze Age is the stage setting for the rise of ancient Israel. I mean, if you wish to speak about the very beginning of ancient Israel, we know about it archaeologically, let's say in the 12th century, maybe the late 13th century BC in the highlands. So we have to take a step back and look at the situation in Canaan before. So I suppose that we need to mention, first of all, the takeover of Canaan by Egypt in the Late Bronze Age by the pharaoh Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty in the 15th century BC. This is the beginning, because at that time, the pharaohs, Egypt, established a system of domination over Canaan. In fact, Canaan was a province of the Egyptian Empire. And there, in this province of the Egyptian Empire, we have enough information archaeologically and also from extra biblical texts in order to reconstruct the historical situation.
Right. So we're starting in a time period in which Egypt and the southern Levant are intricately connected.
Right. When we reconstruct the history of ancient Israel, we need to be very careful not to pluck the history of Canaan, Israel, from the bigger perspective of the ancient Near East and the Levant in particular.
Wow. We will soon be discussing the utter destruction of late Bronze Age society all over the Mediterranean and Near East. And I think for the long history of scholarship in this region, that has served as a break between late Bronze Age life and Iron Age biblical life.
The Late Bronze Age is from 1550 to 1150 BCE, and the Iron Age 1 is from 1150 to 900 BCE.
And so there's a real innovation to argue that the motives and interests of people of the Late Bronze Age city-states might be the same as the Israelite city-states and territorial.
Yeah, sure. You are now touching, on very critical questions of the origin of the ancient Israelites, who they were exactly, and also on something that we will discuss later in the series of the situation in Canaan in the Iron One, which was basically continuation of the Late Bronze Age. So we are in a shift of paradigm. You're right about this. A shift of paradigm from seeing the watershed in Canaan, let's say with a breakdown of the city-states under Egyptian domination in the 12th century BC, to a situation a little bit later of the final breakdown of Canaanite culture and territorial disposition a while later, already within the Iron Age, into the Iron Age.
So how much can we really say at this point, does the Bible or the biblical authors know or remember the Late Bronze Age?
So this is also crucial, because we really described here a situation of what? City-states and Egyptian rule. The Bible does not know about this. There is no clue in the Bible about Egypt actually ruling over Canaan. There is no memory in the Bible of the 14th century BC. And since we know that Egyptian rule in Canaan continued into the 13th century and even became even more powerful maybe under Ramesses II, for instance, and then into the 12th century until the 1130s or so, and still the Bible does not know about them.
Just like he talked about in his book, The Bible on Earth, Egypt had a strong hold on much of the land of Canaan, aka the land of Israel, but the biblical writers, they didn't mention this rulership, and for various reasons that we've gone over before. One of them being that the scriptures are written centuries after these claimed events are supposed to have taken place. And so they didn't have the tools like we have today to help them reconstruct the past. And obviously they left out a lot of details simply from not knowing about them to begin with. And so, as he says, they have no memory of these events. And so let's go on to the next discussion and go ahead and get some more.
In the 12th century, the Late Bronze Age world collapsed. Let's talk about what the significance of this transition is, specifically for setting up the rise of ancient Israel.
So we absolutely need to look at the collapse in order to understand what came next, and the collapse is essential. But first we have to understand what was there before. So it is really important to make a contrast between the situation, let's say, in the middle of the 13th century BC and the situation, let's say, around 1100. So we are comparing 1250 to 1100 BC. 1250, the old world as it used to be, the age of the empires, and a strong Egyptian empires, a strong Hittite empire, Mycenaean palaces in Greece, Cyprus, Alasia, that was the name of the place, was the exporter of copper all around the Eastern Mediterranean. Important city-states in Canaan, important emporia of trade on the coast like Ugarit in the north. This is 1250, the world of the empires. By 1100 BC, there was nothing left of this world. Nothing at all. There was no Hittites. There was no Egypt anymore as an empire. There were no city-states in Canaan as they used to be, or definitely not Ugarit. Alasia was not that important anymore, and so on. Instead, we have a situation of reorganization, which at the end of the process will lead to the rise of a new order of territorial kingdoms, for a while independent of great empires ruling over them for a while.
The collapse of the old empires gave opportunity for a rise of these new territorial kingdoms who were not under the authority of those old great empires.
And we are speaking about a process. So we are not dealing here with, a collapse over 1 minute. Let's say, a friend of ours is describing in a wonderful book, a collapse in 1177, which is good for one part, of the process. But there was a longer process which started probably sometime in the late 13th century and continued for at least a century until the whole thing came down.
How does this happen? I mean, we see this periodically throughout human history, something great like the late Bronze Age imperial system, a global system with international trade and great wealth spread all around the Mediterranean and Near East. How does that come to an end?
Exactly. This is maybe the most dramatic single collapse in the history of the old world, for sure, maybe in the history of the world. This is the crisis here, the big collapse of the great empires of the old world. When I speak to my students, I tell them, listen, you need to compare this to something big as what happened in the beginning of the 20th century after First World War. The entire system changed completely. But this was even more dramatic because they disappeared completely. I mean, the empires of the past. So there were attempts to understand this, to give explanations from the very beginning. People were looking into either historical processes, but then partially explaining the system, because historical process can explain, a situation in Canaan, a situation in Cyprus, a situation in Greece or in Anatolia, but not the big picture of the entire collapse of the system in the Eastern Mediterranean. And at a certain point, scholars started looking at a crisis which was connected to some sort of natural forces. So at a certain moment, they spoke about a storm of earthquakes and things like this. But slowly, in fact, starting in the 60s of the 20th century, there were voices raising the possibility of climate change.
Climate change, it's all the rage these days. How can you even begin to discuss climate change 3,000 years ago?
So first of all, I need to tell you, Matt, and I think that you feel like me. When I came to the university, you came later than me, many years later than me. But when I came to the university, they told me, listen, all the evidence shows that in the last 5,000 years, there was no big change, climate change in our region. But we know today that this is not correct. So this is something, change of paradigm also in the last, 15, 20, 25 years in research.
They had a change of paradigm or way of thinking within the field of research when new evidence was found. And so this just shows the importance of being able to adapt one's understanding in the light of new evidence, which is something that we value.
So how do we know about climate change? What brought about, this thinking that there was a problem with climate behind this collapse of the 13th and 12th centuries BC? The reason is that we turned into different archaeoscience fields, and some of them started giving us information. The most important of them all is pollen research. What is pollen? We are looking for pollen in the air, and the pollen in the air, in fact, gives us information about the vegetation around us. So we sit here with the wonderful cypress trees around us, and other trees around us. And I suppose that there is pollen in the air which will provide information about the vegetation here in Jerusalem today, right? The same goes for antiquity. The question is how to know about pollen in antiquity. The way to go about this is to go to lakes. Why lakes? Because in lakes, in deep lakes especially, the pollen sinks into the bottom of the lake and sits there quietly without currents disturbing the sediments. And then if we come and drill into the sediments at the bottom of the lake and take a core of sediments outside, and the core, in fact, discloses, the history of sediments and history of pollen in the air above the lake or around the lake, in the surroundings of the lake in antiquity. All we need to know is to be able to date the core and to count and identify pollen in the core. And this is what we are doing. So several teams worked about this in recent years. There is a very strong French team who worked in Syria before the crisis in Syria and in Cyprus. And we have our own team. We worked here in the capacity of a big European Research Council research funded by them a few years ago. The leading scholar in this team was Daphna Langut, who is now at Tel Aviv University, an archaeobotanist.
So how does pollen translate into information about climate?
So pollen translates to vegetation around the place where you took the core from. And the vegetation translates to climate, because we are looking at, for instance, the ratio between arboreal and non-arboreal vegetation, which means trees and other vegetation, small vegetation and so on. And we can see vegetation which is more desert-like, which is more steppe-like, or vegetation which signifies a period with lots of precipitation, lots of rain, green, and so on and so forth. This is exactly what pollen tells us. And when we look at the chart that is produced by the core that we took, for instance, from the Sea of Galilee, and the same results from Cyprus and from Syria, we see something very dramatic. We worked also in maybe a little bit better resolution for the period that we are speaking about. So we see basically the most radical crisis, climate crisis, in the history of this country, in the Bronze and Iron Ages, in the period of time between 1250 and 1100 BC.
And just keep watching, because they're going to eventually explain how this climate change led to this big crisis in the late Bronze Age, which set the stage for these new territorial developments, which included the Israelites, right? Just keep watching, because they're going to eventually tie it together.
Exactly the period of the collapse of the city-states in Canaan and of these empires around us, what we know from the textual material of the ancient Near East. So, a big crisis.
So the pollen in the air lands on the lake, sinks to the bottom, and at the bottom of a lake should be stratified layers of pollen over time.
Yes, we need to look for organic material along the core in order to radiocarbon date these samples. And then by having a few samples along the core, and then by looking also at the lamina, in the core, we can really reconstruct almost, maybe not year by year, but we, for instance, worked in a resolution of a sample every 20-25 years, which was really unheard of before, and which gave us a lot of information.
So it works a lot like archaeology. You identify the layer, you date the layer with some sort of radiocarbon, and then you count the pollen inside of that layer.
Yeah, like you look at the material culture of the layer. So in this case, you look at the pollen.
Right. So if I find that there is tons of olive pollen in one particular layer, and less of some other type of thing, I can start to talk about the vegetation of a region. How would you define this major change in climate? Are things getting wetter, drier, snowier? What's going on?
Exactly. So this is a wonderful question, because we are sitting, let's say, shift ourselves from Jerusalem, which is more problematic from the point of view of climate, to Tel Aviv or to Megiddo. The two of us work at Megiddo, so we know very well the environment of Megiddo. You sit at Megiddo, and let's say the average precipitation is somewhere around 550, 600 millimeters per year.
That's roughly 19 to 23 inches of rain per year.
Drop 20%. You get to what? 500. Well, you can manage. No big
crops are going to be the same.
Yeah, one can manage. However, please remember that we are surrounded here in the Levant by steppe regions on two sides. So we have the sea on one side, in the west. In the east, desert. In the south, desert. And many of the important places are located on the desert fringe. Amman in Jordan gets something like 250, 300 millimeters per year.
Which is roughly 10 to 12 inches of rain per year, which is a relatively small amount of rain for any serious crop production. And so when droughts came, they caused a major problem, which is what the professor is going to explain.
Damascus gets something between 250 and 300 millimeters per year. So if you take Megiddo down by 20%, nothing happens. If you take Damascus down by 20%, you have a catastrophe, basically, because then the whole thing starts collapsing. And you know, by the way, that some people think and speak about it, and there were many scholarly articles pro and con this notion that the crisis that we see in Syria today, in recent years, is the product of several continuous years of droughts in Syria on the desert fringe 15 years ago.
So when we talk about the collapse of late Bronze Age society from Greece to Mesopotamia, and we talk about climate change, we have to understand, as you are suggesting, that climate change impacts different regions in different ways. But because this entire world was such an integrated system, that the collapse in certain parts could cascade to other parts.
Yes, exactly. This is maybe one of the most important points to stress. The late Bronze system was a system that was well connected from Greece in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, and from Anatolia in the north to Egypt in the south. Connected by trade, by diplomatic relations, and by the entire economic system of globalization of the Egyptian empire, perhaps, and so on. And once, the system starts collapsing, then started a domino effect which brought the entire world of the Bronze Age down at the end of the 12th century BC.
So the pollen evidence strongly indicates that there was increasing dryness in the desert margins, which began to impact some very important city-states, such as Damascus,
Right.
Amman.
Yeah.
What other lines of evidence can we look at that would help us understand this moment in time?
So so first of all, we need to remember, and we spoke about it a little bit, but I think it's not too bad to reiterate, that we are dealing with three lines of evidence that go together very well and point to the period of time between 1250 and 1100 BC. One is the pollen evidence for a dramatic climate crisis, dry period, at least in the Levant and around us. The second piece of information is simply the history of destruction of cities. The entire destruction of cities and states in the region started sometime in the beginning of the 12th century. Let's say Ugarit in the north collapsed on the Syrian coast. The big emporium there on the coast was destroyed sometime in the very beginning of the 12th century, and then continuously until the late 12th century. Megiddo, where the two of us are working, you remember the information that we have from Megiddo is very late 12th century, so 50, 60 years after Ugarit, and there are other places that were destroyed before. For instance, Hatzor in the north of Israel, which was destroyed maybe in the middle or the second half of the 13th century BC. The other line of evidence is the textual material, which is very dramatic, because we do have, in fact, information about a crisis of drought and famine in the region. So we are not inventing something here only according to the pollen evidence. We are also reading about it in the texts of the ancient Near East. Which texts? The texts which were found in Ugarit on the coast in the north, the text from Hatti, the Hittite Empire, text from Emar on the Euphrates, all from the north, and they all speak about this process about big problem with droughts that bring about famine, and they cry for help. And some of them cry for help from Egypt, because Egypt is not dictated, the climate in Egypt, by the climate of the Eastern Mediterranean, but rather by the water that comes with the Nile from the south. So they cry for help. So the problem really starts sometime in the middle of the 13th century and continues until the late 12th century BC.
What's the connection between this climate change and the destruction of all of these cities? I mean, it's not such a direct and obvious connection.
So before we explain exactly what happened, I wish to cite a study which is really essential for understanding this. And this is a study by Ronnie Ellenblum of the Hebrew University here in Jerusalem, published by Cambridge University Press a while ago, describing a comparable climate crisis in the second half of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th century CE, which means 1,000 years ago. And why is this important? Because for the 10th and 11th centuries CE, 1,000 years ago, we have a full coverage of textual material from Egypt, from Cairo, from Baghdad, from Constantinople, Istanbul, from Damascus, from all over the area. And we can really compare the records and see what happened. Now,
this is the period of the Crusades.
This is, it ends just before the Crusades, I would say. It starts around 950 and it ends around 10, according to Ellenblum, around 1070 CE. Now, Ellenblum was essential because he's working with textual material, which is gives us a full picture. When we speak about antiquity, really the Bronze Age, we do not have the full picture. He has the full picture from the textual material. And what he describes is interesting in two ways. First of all, that a part or on top, in addition to problem with precipitation, to droughts, there was a big problem with cold spells in the north. And cold spells are more deadly, more lethal than a problem of precipitation, because when one gets a cold spell, the crops are dead, all the crops, everything is dead, the agricultural output, and people have to start moving, looking for food. There's no other way. The second, and then starts a domino effect, sort of speaking. The second issue that we need to take a look at from the perspective of the Ellenblum research is the fact that the problem is not that the rain stops for 50 years. We are not dealing with a situation like this, of course. But it becomes crucial when you get, let's say, 10 years of drought, and then there is recovery, but the recovery is not long enough. So if the recovery, let's say, is only 2 years, and then you get another set of 10 years of droughts, then you are dead. And now we can turn back to your question.
What is the connection between climate change and actual destruction? When we find that Hatzor is destroyed or Ugarit is destroyed, an entire city burned to the ground.
Yeah, so I think that we need to think about two different processes that really combine together. First one is what's going on in the north. If indeed there were cold spells in the north, so this could have pushed groups in the north to start moving southwards in search of food into other parts, and then raid cities and destroy them and bring about a total unrest and collapse. The second situation is here in the Levant. Let's say Damascus, for instance. If indeed we have a situation of drop in Damascus or in Amman or in Aleppo or in Gaza or in Ashkelon in the south, those cities, big cities which are located on the desert fringe, and there starts a problem with droughts, so then slowly people start moving, and there are groups of then those, if you wish, Apiru or others, and they start raiding cities. So You know, for us today to think about raiding a big city, we think about big armies, tanks and cannons and airplanes and whatever. This was not the situation in antiquity. For instance, in Ugarit, we get the information from the text. They speak about a few ships coming, and they are terrified. Maybe each of them carrying 50, 60 warriors, and they are completely terrified because they cannot chase them quickly enough. And these people can organize and come and attack a city and destroy it in no time. And once a city is destroyed, then you have the ripple effects on the other cities in the region, and then they come down one after the other. And again, we are dealing with the process which starts sometime in the second half of the 13th century and continues for a long time. But at the end of this process, nothing is left of the old regime.
So before we continue to our discussion of the Israelites, there's still some very interesting questions here. We know that at the end of this process, the Egyptian Empire is gone. We've talked about the Sea Peoples. We've talked about climate change. We've talked about other migrations. What were the Egyptians doing in the face of these new challenges?
So Egypt was a big empire, and it was well administered. So I don't see the Egyptians sitting here and doing nothing. And in fact, there is, for the first time in the last 10, 15 years, information to show us that the Egyptians tried to react, that they noticed that something was going on, and that something poses problems to their empire, to their grip over these territories, both in Canaan and along the coast. And the inscriptions of Ramesses that you mentioned a few minutes ago are connected to this. So we now have evidence from archaeology and maybe even from Poland to show that the Egyptians at a certain point in the 12th century or even the very late 13th century started shifting the agriculture, at least here in Canaan, into a different system directed at producing more grain in order probably to supply grain to the steppe regions. So we see this at Megiddo in the animal husbandry evidence which comes from archaeozoology, more cows for plowing the fields, and more sickle blades at the end of the late Bronze Age. And we see this in the growing evidence for pollen of that comes from grain in the Sea of Galilee. And we see this in a very interesting piece of evidence about the introduction of zebu cattle into the region. We get this from ancient DNA investigation that I was involved with Meirav Meiri, a researcher from Tel Aviv University, doing the actual work, showing that they tried to introduce animals which were more adapt to dry areas in order to support the agriculture of the country. And in fact, when we look at the evidence, we see that they were successful, at least for a while, because in the north, the collapse can be dated to the beginning of the 12th century, around, let's say, 1180, 85 BC, whereas in the south, the final collapse came only 50, 60 years later. So they managed, in fact, to postpone the collapse for at least half a century.
So where do the Israelites fit in?
Well, so why did we do all this? Why did we speak about the crisis? We spoke about the crisis to say the following, that we see this wave of settlement, strong settlement in the highlands, starting sometime in the late 13th century, continuing in the 12th century, and peaking, I suppose, in the 11th century BC. And this too, I think, is climate related. And why am I saying this? Because the economy, the local economy of Canaan in the Bronze Age was established on this system that has sedentary people and pastoral nomads.
Pastoral nomads are people who roam the fields with their herds of sheep, goats, and other flock animals. And so it's making them have to stop roaming and begin to settle down, as is about to be explained coming up.
and the pastoral nomads can engage in pastoral nomadism and supply their products to the city dwellers only because the city dwellers and the villages can supply them with grain. And the grain must come from the surplus of grain in the fields of these city-states. Now, once a crisis starts and the city-states cannot supply enough grain, this must push the pastoral nomads to settle down.
And they needed to grow their own grain because they couldn't live on meat alone.
And because we think that for other reasons, and we will be speaking about it later, that the early Israelites, at least some of them, settled down, came from pastoral nomadic background, maybe the crisis pushed them to settle down because there was not enough surplus of grain to support them. And another point that needs to be stressed is that unlike other periods when a climate crisis ends with getting back to normal, what we see in the record of the Sea of Galilee, the pollen record, is that after this crisis in the 11th century, we are entering a phase which was wetter than the normal in the region, and this could have enabled the people in the highlands to establish themselves in a more agricultural formation system in the 11th century BC.
He's saying that during this period, the evidence shows that it was wetter, which means that it had more rain in these highland areas, which allowed them to be more prosperous in the grain production. Now that we know about the collapse of the Late Bronze Age and what the evidence points to for being the cause, let's find out what happened afterwards that pushed people towards the formation of this group called the Israelites, according to the archaeological evidence.
In our last episode, we talked about the collapse of Late Bronze Age civilization. What happened after the collapse?
The collapse of the Late Bronze opened the way to major changes in the history of the Levant in general and the land of Israel in particular, because the outcome is the rise of the territorial kingdoms, including the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the two Hebrew kingdoms. So the major process that needs to be looked at in order to understand the rise of the territorial kingdoms is the process of the wave of settlement that takes place in the highlands west of the Jordan River and east of the Jordan River. These are the people that become Israel and Judah and Ammon and Moab and Aram, including Aram Damascus, in the coming centuries.
Who are these people? They don't come from nowhere.
No, they don't come from nowhere. We see them very clearly, especially we see them as a result of the very intensive surveys that were conducted in the highlands especially, and especially west of the Jordan River in the 1980s. We need to ask later in our conversation about their origin, of course. But first, it's enough now to say that these are the people that can be described as proto-Israel, proto-Ammon, if you wish, proto-Moab, or the early Israelites.
These people who settled in these regions can be described as proto-Israelites, proto-Ammon, and proto-Moab. And proto just means first or original. Come on with it.
Why am I saying this? Because they sit in the same territory where the two Hebrew kingdoms are going to rise about 2 centuries after the collapse of Canaan, of Egyptian rule and city-states, Canaanite city-states. And there is continuity in the settlement systems, which means even when we conduct our surveys, I myself carried out a major survey in the highlands in the 1980s, 30 years ago and more. And most of the sites where we encountered pottery from, let's say, the Iron Age II, the 9th and 8th centuries, the time of the Israelite kingdom, or those people working in, archaeologists working in Judah, 8th, 7th century Judahite sites, one can see that these sites were inhabited before, and the roots go back to the 12th or 11th centuries BC. So there is continuity, and therefore it is legitimate to call them proto-Israelites or early Israelites.
So, can we identify these proto Israelites with the people called Israel in the famous Merneptah stele?
Oh, yes, this is a big question. The Merneptah stele is a very important one. We need, first of all, to speak about it a word or two. We are dealing here with a stele that was established, erected by King Merneptah of Egypt. He ruled in the late 13th century, and he describes a campaign that he carried out into the land of Canaan. And he mentions several cities, such as Gezer, Yenoam, and so on. And then there is this famous verse, sentence where he says, he speaks about Israel, and he says that Israel is no more. The determinative for Israel in the stele is for people. So he is not speaking about a mountain or a river or a territory, he's speaking about people. So there is a group of people living in Canaan in the late 13th century, and their name is Israel. The question, of course, is exactly where and how big they are. We don't know. This is the true answer. We can discuss it for a long time, but we don't know. I suppose that we are dealing with groups in the Central Highlands west of the Jordan, in my opinion. We are probably dealing with not very big groups. And this is an important issue that needs to be revisited when we speak about the earliest territorial entity named Israel, because the name Israel appears here for the first time. And then there is a gap of several centuries until the name Israel appears for the second time. And I'm speaking about the middle of the 9th century in the inscription of Shalmaneser III describing the Battle of Karkar in the time of Ahab, a king of Israel. Still, the mention of Israel in the Merneptah stele is extremely important for understanding the rise of ancient Israel.
So, where are these people coming from?
Starting in the 70s, in fact, late 60s of the 20th century, major surveys had been conducted in the highlands, mainly west of the Jordan, but also in Jordan, in the Kingdom of Jordan, in Transjordan. And they showed, in fact, one thing in a very clear way, that there were several ups and downs in the history of these regions in the Bronze and Iron Ages. Wave of settlement and decline, wave of settlement and decline. So the first wave in the early Bronze, decline in the intermediate Bronze, another wave in the major part of the Middle Bronze Age, decline in the Late Bronze, and then again this wave of the Iron One. And in fact, some of the sites that when you come to pick up pottery, in the surveys, some of the sites portray the same picture, which means wave, decline, wave, decline in the same site. You pick up the same kind of pottery, early Bronze, Middle Bronze, Iron One. And then also in excavations of the Iron One sites in the highlands, it was impossible to see any evidence of groups coming from outside. So the inevitable conclusion was that we are speaking about processes within the population of the country, within the population of Canaan. Those ups and downs, prosperity and decline, sometimes in the same place and sometimes very dramatic. In the Middle Bronze, for instance, west of the Jordan, altogether 250 sites, declining to 30, 35 sites in the Late Bronze, and then again up to 250 sites in the Iron One, and many more, twice as much in the Iron Two. So these are the ups and downs.
So there's a longue durée pattern going on here, but what does it mean?
There is a longue durée. There are two ways to explain it. Theoretically speaking, you can describe, people coming from outside and settling in the same places time and again. It's not very convincing, right? So we are dealing apparently with changes in, first of all, of course, settlement patterns, but also subsistence economy. The typical situation in Canaan, also the typical situation in the land of Israel in Palestine, if you wish, until in the Ottoman period, was that of shifts along the settlement continuum between periods when people were more sedentary and periods when people shifted to more pastoral way of life, according to changing economic and geopolitical and administrative situations. So, for instance, we can see this very clearly in the 19th century CE and the beginning of the 20th century. There's this book, Settlement History of Jordan and Syria, 1800-1980, which means in the last 200 years, by Lewis, that was published in the 80s. And he brings evidence from travelers, from documents, people going in Transjordan along the steppe region in a certain period of time, and they describe prosperity, many villages, people, the traveler, the researcher is sipping tea here and there, and then 20 years later there's nobody there. The villages are deserted. Why? Because situations changed, because of maybe a little bit of climate, maybe molestation by the regime, maybe conscription to the military. They didn't want to go, so they ran away. The people knew how to change very quickly between pastoral mode of subsistence and sedentary life.
And to me, this is pretty amazing that they knew how to make those changes at the drop of a dime. They could adapt their livelihood between a majority focus on sheep herding over to being a settlement people and vice versa, right? Whenever they needed to do so, they could do it. Very impressive skills.
And this is essential for understanding also the situation in Iron 1. We are dealing, when we see the ups and downs, with periods of more sedentary activity, never completely sedentary. We will speak about it in a minute, I suppose. But more sedentary, and then changes to a more pastoral way of production.
In this particular wave of settlement in the Iron One, why did these people settle down?
This is the $64,000 question, of course. I think that here it was very difficult to explain this until a few years ago. And here I go back to our conversation about the crisis and the climate change at the end of the late Bronze Age. Because until we managed to notice, according to pollen studies, that to identify this climate crisis at the end of the Bronze Age, it was difficult to explain indeed. Why such a big change in the mode of production, in the settlement patterns and so on? Now we do understand, I think, because the typical situation in Canaan and the later centuries in the Levant is this distinction between settlers and nomads. Now, we understand today that nomadic way of life, of pastoral nomadic way of life, is an outcome, an offshoot of sedentary life. And it depends on the ability of the settled people to produce enough surplus of grain. If the sedentary people produce enough surplus of grain, this enables people to engage in pastoral nomadism, and then, of course, prosper better because they can specialize in pastoral production. And those in the sedentary lands specialize in grain growing and other productions of sedentary life. Now, in view of the climate crisis, when the climate crisis started, slowly, gradually, the sedentary communities could not produce anymore enough surplus of grain in order to enable this pastoral way of life. And the outcome was that the pastoral people who had the know-how how to shift back to sedentary life indeed took this step and went back to sedentary life in order to produce their own grain. And this is the reason, at least for the change at the end of the Bronze Age, from the late Bronze to the Iron One, this is probably the main mover, the prime mover behind the process of the wave of settlement in the highlands.
You've described a very interesting picture of the rise of ancient Israel as you've pieced it together from the archaeology of the region. But the Bible tells a very different story, one with a lot more detail and narration.
Sure, the Bible tells the story of the history of ancient Israel in a sequential way, which is the opposite of cyclic processes of ups and downs in settlement systems and so on. The Bible starts with the patriarchs, and then Egypt, and then Exodus, and then conquest, and settling, and kingdoms, and so on. We have described something very different. The Bible, in my opinion, does not have any recollection of the situation in the Bronze Age. It is very easy to prove. The Bible has no recollection, we spoke about it, of the crisis at the end of the Bronze Age, no memory of the end of the Egyptian system, no memory of Egypt in Canaan.
And some people take this as an attack, but it's not. This is just the reality of the situation. The authors of the Bible, they either didn't have a clue about the end of the Bronze Age and the Egyptian control over Canaan, or they knew about it and it just wasn't an important enough history for them to fit into the narrative that they created. But the fact is, the Bible doesn't mention it, and that's not the professor attacking the Bible, right? The scholars, they already gave the Bible a million chances to show its reliability, but it has not proven itself to be so. And so the people shouldn't get mad when the scholars start looking elsewhere for other answers and other explanations.
And I think the Bible does not have really any memory of the Iron One. For instance, we know that this is the phase of settlement of the sea peoples along the coast. We will be speaking about it in one of the future conversations. The Bible does not really have any recollection of this. The Bible speaks about the early history of ancient Israel, picking up traditions and memories here and there, definitely, but setting them in order to promote the ideology of the later authors.
And that's the key. It's crafting a narrative in a way that promotes the agenda of later authors, which I don't find much problem with at all, right? I don't find fault with them for doing what they felt they needed to do. These are humans that we're talking about, and humans have agendas. There's no mystery in that needs to be discovered at all.
So we need to understand the later authors in order to understand what the Bible tries to tell us. So the conquest of Joshua, for instance, is basically a conquest to be, which is told in order to promote the goals of the authors in Jerusalem in the time of King Josiah in the late 7th century BC. I hope to be speaking about it with you in the future. And the period of the judges, quote unquote, is picked up from traditions that come from Israel, from the north, in order ostensibly to describe the period in between the conquest and the monarchy. However, there is good reason to believe that the description is that of the situation in the very early days of the Northern Kingdom. So in the Bible, in fact, we do not have a portrayal of the situation in Canaan and in the period between, let's say, the 13th and the 11th centuries BC.
Okay, so that's the rise of ancient Israel. Let's summarize. There's a lot of material.
Yeah, let's try to summarize this. In order to understand the rise of ancient Israel, we need to look at the settlement patterns. We need to look at modes of production. We need to divert a little bit to the side of anthropology, in fact. And we see these cyclic processes, these ups and downs in the highlands, starting in the early Bronze, which means starting in the late 4th millennium BC and continuing until the rise of the territorial kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And we need to decipher this on the background of shifts between more pastoral and more sedentary mode of productions, according to shifting, to changes, to transformations, economic, political, geopolitical, in the region and beyond, in fact. We need to understand the ancient Israelites as Canaanites.
We need to understand the ancient Israelites as Canaanites. This right here hurts a lot of people's feelings, but the truth shall make you free. Understand?
They come from the local stock of Canaan. We see this in the settlement patterns, and we see this also in the material culture. And in the beginning, they are part of the other groups that will later become Moab and Ammon and Damascus and so on. And they distinguish themselves with the rise of the territorial kingdoms.
They distinguished themselves from who? Tribes like Ammon and Moab, who all came from the same local stock. And how did they distinguish themselves from the other tribes who shared similar physical traits?
And their material culture becomes apparent, distinguished from each other also in the later centuries.
That's how, from their culture, which is how people have always distinguished themselves before the destructive concept of race was invented. And so this is just a little background on the formation of the Israelites according to archaeology. And so I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Dr. Matthew Adams and Professor Israel Finkelstein. And it's conversations like these from field experts that bring information and bring awareness to other people that can help one climb one more rung on the ladder out of the pit to get into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.